1943, a shipyard at night. Arc welders throwing white light across the hull of a destroyer, sparks falling like slow rain into the black water of the Chesapeake. A banner stretched across the scaffolding, "We build for victory." That shipyard belonged to Bethlehem Steel, and in that year this one company was producing roughly a ship a day for the United States military. At its peak, Bethlehem Steel employed over 300,000 people. Its steel held up the Golden Gate Bridge, the Empire State Building, the George Washington Bridge. The nation's skyline was their signature. This company survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and 100 years of market cycles. On paper, it should have lasted forever. By 2003, it was gone, bankrupt, liquidated, sold for $325 million. 95,000 retirees lost their full pensions. Entire towns lost their reason to exist. Not a scandal, not fraud, not a reckless CEO, not a workforce that stopped caring. Imagine standing inside the Bethlehem plant in 1996, 1 year after the last steel was poured. The furnaces are cold. The only sound in a building engineered for noise that could rupture an eardrum, your own footsteps, echoing off soot-stained walls, the smell of rust, the cold radiating off structures that haven't been warm in months. How does the most essential company in America become a ruin? How does a system that built the modern world lose to competitors a tenth its size? And how does an empire with 300,000 workers simply stop? The answer isn't a villain or a mistake, it's a structure, a system so perfectly built for one world that it couldn't survive the next. This is the story of the company that built America and the system that made it impossible to save. There is a place in eastern Pennsylvania where the Lehigh River bends through a valley, and if you stand on the south bank at dusk, you can see them. 5 blast furnaces, each one rising 100 feet into the sky, rusted the colour of dried blood. They haven't made steel in 30 years. Nothing moves, no cranes, no rail cars, no molten iron pouring white hot into casting beds, just wind pushing through the stacks, and sometimes, on summer nights, the glow of a concert stage rigged up beneath the furnaces, coloured light bouncing off structures that once produced temperatures hotter than the surface of Venus. This is Steel Stacks, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And these furnaces are not ruins, they are evidence. Evidence of one of the most extraordinary industrial empires ever built on American soil, a company that forged the steel for the Golden Gate Bridge, the Empire State Building, the George Washington Bridge, and more than 1,000 warships that helped win the Second World War. A company that at its peak employed over 300,000 people, a company that didn't just supply America, it was America structurally, literally, beam by beam and rivet by rivet. Bethlehem Steel. And if you only knew the first half of the story, you'd assume it was still here. You'd assume a company this essential, this embedded in the skeleton of the nation, would be permanent, untouchable, too big, too critical, too deeply woven into the country's infrastructure to ever disappear. But it did disappear, not in a scandal, not in a single catastrophic decision, not because of fraud, or a hostile takeover, or one terrible CEO. It disappeared the way a bridge fails, not from one crack, but from 1,000 microfractures that nobody measured until the whole span was sagging. By 2003, Bethlehem Steel was gone, liquidated. Its assets sold to a company most Americans had never heard of. Its pension obligations, for over 95,000 retirees, dumped onto the federal government. Its plants closed, its towns hollowed, its workforce scattered, and the furnaces stayed, standing in the valley like headstones for something that used to be alive. Here's what makes this story different from every other corporate collapse narrative you've heard. Bethlehem Steel didn't die because it made a bad product. It didn't die because its workers were lazy. It didn't die because its leaders were stupid. In many ways, it died because of what made it great. Its scale, its complexity, its vertical integration, its long-term obligations, its identity as the kind of company that does everything, owns everything, and never backs down from a challenge. The system that built an empire became the system that couldn't adapt when the world changed. And by the time anyone inside Bethlehem Steel understood what was happening, the math was already impossible. This is not a story about a factory, it's a story about a system. How it was built, why it worked, when it cracked, and what it teaches anyone who thinks dominance is the same thing as durability. So let's go back. Back before the blast furnaces, back before the warships, back before the bridges and the skyscrapers, back to a river valley in Pennsylvania, where a small iron company was about to become something nobody planned for. In 1857, a company called the Saucona Iron Company was incorporated along the banks of the Lehigh River in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The name wouldn't last. Within a few years, it was reorganized as the Bethlehem Iron Company, a modest operation producing iron rails for a country that was building railroads as fast as it could lay track. This was not glamorous work. It was hot, dangerous, and repetitive, but it was necessary. America in the mid-19th century was a nation obsessed with connection. Rail lines pushing west, bridges spanning rivers, telegraph wires stitching cities together, and all of it needed iron. Bethlehem Iron was one of dozens of companies feeding this appetite, and in the early years there was nothing about it that screamed future empire. The town of Bethlehem itself was a small, quiet place, founded by Moravian settlers over a century earlier, built around a church and a sense of order. The river ran through it, the hills rose on either side, and then the furnaces came and the town changed. Not overnight, but steadily. The rhythm of Bethlehem shifted from church bells to shift whistles. The sky, once clear, took on a permanent haze. The population grew, workers arriving from across Pennsylvania, then from across Europe. Irish, Welsh, Hungarian, Slovak, German. They came because the furnaces were hiring, and the furnaces were always hiring, but iron was iron. It was strong enough for rails, but not strong enough for what was coming. The year 1886 is when the story pivots. Not loudly. There was no explosion, no dramatic boardroom confrontation. It was a contract, a government contract. The United States Navy needed armor plate, heavy, forged steel capable of withstanding naval artillery, and Bethlehem Iron won the bid. This single decision changed the DNA of the company. Think about what that means. One day you're making railroad rails, long, flat, repetitive products shipped by the thousands. The next day you're forging armor plate for warships, massive, complex, custom-engineered slabs of steel that have to meet military specifications no commercial product ever demanded. The tolerances are tighter, the temperatures are higher, the stakes are existential. If your armor fails, sailors die. Bethlehem Iron didn't just accept the contract, it rebuilt itself around it. New forging presses were installed, enormous machines capable of shaping steel under pressures that would crush a locomotive. New furnaces were designed to reach temperatures that could make steel flow like water. The workforce was retrained. The engineering department expanded. The entire orientation of the company shifted from civilian commodity to military capability. And here's the detail that matters. This wasn't a temporary pivot. This wasn't a side project. Bethlehem Iron internalized war production as a core competency. It learned how to think in terms of military contracts, government relationships, and strategic materials. It learned how to be indispensable, not just useful, but necessary for national defense. A factory that learns war before it learns peace becomes a different kind of organism. It becomes harder to replace, harder to regulate, harder to say no to. Because once you're the company that makes the armor that protects American ships, you're not just a business. You're infrastructure, you're policy. You're woven into the way the government thinks about readiness. And Bethlehem learned this lesson early. Decades before the World Wars, decades before the great shipbuilding campaigns, this company understood something that would define its entire existence. The most durable market advantage isn't efficiency or price, it's necessity. If they need you, they'll pay you. If they need you badly enough, they'll pay you whatever you ask. This insight, this deep structural understanding of how to make yourself essential, would carry Bethlehem Steel to extraordinary heights. And it would also eventually become a trap, because necessity is not permanent. What a nation needs today, it may not need tomorrow, and a company built entirely around being needed has no idea what to do when the need fades, but that's decades away. In 1886, the furnaces are roaring, the Navy contracts are flowing, and Bethlehem Iron is becoming something larger than a regional manufacturer. It's becoming a strategic asset. By the end of the 19th century, Bethlehem Iron had outgrown its name. In 1899, it was reorganized as the Bethlehem Steel Company, a name that carried weight, ambition, and a signal to the market. This is not an ironworks anymore. This is a steel empire in formation. But the real transformation came in 1904, when the company was restructured again as the Bethlehem Steel Corporation. The difference between a company and a corporation might sound like legal paperwork, but it mattered. A corporation could issue stock on a different scale. It could acquire other companies. It could build a web of subsidiaries, mines, mills, shipyards, railroads, company towns, all feeding into a single integrated system. And that's exactly what Bethlehem Steel began to do. The model was vertical integration, control everything from the raw ore in the ground to the finished beam on the construction site. Own the mines, own the railroads that carry the ore, own the coke plants that process the coal, own the blast furnaces that smelt the iron, own the rolling mills that shape the steel, own the shipyards that build the vessels, own the towns where the workers live. On paper, this is a brilliant strategy. Every link in the chain that you own is a link where you don't pay someone else's margin. Every input you control is an input that can't be disrupted by a supplier's strike or a competitor's bid. You become self-sufficient, self-sustaining, a closed system. But closed systems have a cost that doesn't show up on the balance sheet, at least not immediately. Every mine you own has to be maintained. Every railroad needs track repair. Every company town needs infrastructure. Every furnace needs relining. The fixed costs accumulate like sediment. Invisible at first, heavy later. In 1904, none of that mattered. What mattered was scale. What mattered was that Bethlehem Steel was no longer competing with local iron makers. It was positioning itself to compete with the biggest industrial operations on Earth. It had military contracts. It had steel-making capacity. It had a growing footprint across the eastern seaboard. All it needed was someone willing to push the accelerator to the floor. The furnaces were ready. They just needed someone willing to feed them everything. His name was Charles M. Schwab, and he was not a cautious man. Don't confuse him with the brokerage founder. This Charles Schwab was born in 1862 in Williamsburg, Pennsylvania, and he came up through the steel industry the hard way. He'd worked for Andrew Carnegie. He'd risen to president of U.S. Steel, the largest corporation in the world at the time. And then he left, because U.S. Steel was too slow for him, too bureaucratic, too conservative. Charles Schwab didn't want to manage an empire, he wanted to build one. In 1903, he took control of Bethlehem Steel, and the company changed personality overnight. Where the previous leadership had been methodical, careful expansion, measured risk, steady contracts, Schwab was ravenous. He saw Bethlehem not as a steel company, but as a potential industrial colossus, and he moved with a speed that alarmed competitors and thrilled investors. New plants were commissioned before old ones were fully operational. New product lines were launched while existing ones were still being optimized. Acquisitions happened not in sequence but in parallel. Mines, mills, fabrication shops, all being absorbed simultaneously. Schwab understood something about industrial capitalism that many of his contemporaries missed. In a market defined by scale, the company that grows fastest wins, not the company that grows most efficiently, not the company that grows most carefully, the company that grows fastest. Because scale creates its own advantages: volume discounts, political leverage, workforce depth, brand authority. Once you're big enough, the market bends around you. And Schwab made Bethlehem Steel very big, very fast. He invested heavily in a revolutionary steel rolling process called the grey beam mill, a technology that could produce wide-flange structural beams more efficiently than anything else in the world. This wasn't a minor improvement. Wide-flange beams were the building blocks of the modern skyscraper. They were lighter, stronger, and easier to work with than the older riveted sections. And Bethlehem Steel, thanks to Schwab's investment, had a near monopoly on producing them. Think about what that means. Every architect designing a tall building, every engineer planning a major bridge, every contractor bidding on a government project that required structural steel. They all needed wide-flange beams, and for years there was essentially one place to get them. Schwab also expanded Bethlehem's military production. More armor plate, more gun forgings, more naval components. He cultivated relationships with the War Department and the Navy with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He was charming, relentless, and politically savvy. He understood that government contracts weren't just revenue, they were insurance. A company that the military depends on doesn't go bankrupt. It doesn't get broken up by trustbusters. It doesn't face the same market pressures as a company selling commodity steel to construction firms. Under Schwab, Bethlehem Steel became dual-natured. half commercial giant, half defense contractor, and this dual nature gave it a resilience that pure commercial companies didn't have. When the civilian market softened, military orders kept the furnaces running. When military spending dipped, commercial construction filled the gap. It was a hedge built into the structure of the company itself. But Schwab's acceleration came with a hidden price tag. Every new plant meant new fixed costs. Every acquisition meant new obligations, pensions, maintenance, community expectations. Every expansion of the system made the system harder to change. And Schwab, for all his brilliance, never built an off switch. He built a machine designed to grow. Growth was the only gear it had. The company changes personality under Schwab. It becomes confident, aggressive, dominant. It starts to believe that expansion is the answer to every question. And for decades that belief will be validated by war, by construction booms, by a nation that seems to need infinite steel. But belief is not strategy, and a machine that can only grow will eventually meet a world that asks it to shrink. Now comes the montage, the part of the story where the scale becomes almost absurd. Picture this. It's the 1920s and 1930s, and America is building upward. The skyline of New York City is changing month by month. Towers are rising, not just buildings, but statements of ambition, monuments to the idea that there is no limit to what can be constructed if you have enough steel and enough nerve. And inside almost every one of these structures, holding up the floors, bracing the walls, spanning the gaps between columns, Bethlehem Steel, the Golden Gate Bridge, those massive cables, those sweeping towers suspended above the fog of San Francisco Bay. Bethlehem Steel, the George Washington Bridge connecting Manhattan to New Jersey across the Hudson River, carrying more traffic than any bridge in the world. Bethlehem Steel. The Empire State Building, which rose at a pace of 4.5 floors per week during construction, a speed that still seems impossible. Bethlehem Steel. Rockefeller Center, that cathedral of commerce in Midtown Manhattan. Bethlehem Steel. Bridges, tunnels, office towers, government buildings, naval yards, railroad terminals, dams, power plants. If it was big, if it was structural, if it was American, there was a better-than-even chance that Bethlehem Steel had supplied the bones. And here's the number that puts it in perspective. At its peak, Bethlehem Steel was the second largest steel producer in the United States and one of the largest in the world. Only US Steel was bigger. But Bethlehem had something US Steel often lacked, a reputation for quality in structural and military applications that made it the first call for the most demanding projects. The workers knew this, and it mattered to them. There's a kind of pride that comes from building something you can see, not something abstract, not a financial product, not a line of code, not a quarterly earnings report, something physical, something you can drive past with your kids and say, I made that. My hands were part of that. Bethlehem steelworkers could point to the skyline of New York City and say that. They could point to the bridges of San Francisco and say that. They could point to warships in the harbor and say that. This pride was real, and it was earned. The work was brutal. 12-hour shifts in heat that could blister skin at a distance. Noise levels that left men partially deaf by 40. Air thick with particulates that shortened lives by years. The blast furnaces ran around the clock, and the men who fed them lived on a rhythm dictated by molten iron, not by daylight. You ate when the furnace let you eat. You slept when the furnace let you sleep, and you did it because the pay was steady, the union was strong, and the thing you were building was the country itself. But pride doesn't appear on a balance sheet either, and the same scale that generated that pride was quietly building something else, a cost structure that would become, over decades, an anchor. Here's where the open loop deepens. Because while Bethlehem Steel was building America's skyline, it was also building something less visible, a sprawling empire of obligations. Every plant Bethlehem operated needed maintenance. Not cosmetic upkeep, but deep industrial maintenance. Blast furnace relinings that cost millions and took weeks. Rolling mill upgrades that required shutting down entire production lines. Rail systems, water treatment plants, power generation facilities, all owned by Bethlehem, all aging, all demanding capital. Every worker Bethlehem employed came with a promise, a pension, health benefits, the implicit guarantee that if you gave your body to the furnace for 30 years, the company would take care of you when the furnace was done with you. These promises were made in good times when the money was flowing and the future seemed infinite. They were made by men who assumed the good times would never end, and each promise, individually, was reasonable. Collectively, over decades, across hundreds of thousands of workers, they became a mountain. Every town Bethlehem anchored depended on it, not just for jobs, but for tax revenue, for infrastructure, for identity. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Sparrows Point, Maryland. Lackawanna, New York. These weren't just places where Bethlehem had plants. These were places where Bethlehem was the economy. The company was the largest employer, the largest taxpayer, the largest customer for local businesses. When Bethlehem thrived, the town thrived. When Bethlehem struggled, there was nothing else. This is the architecture of a trap, and it's worth pausing to understand it, because it's the same trap that has caught dozens of industrial giants over the past century. When you're growing, fixed costs are your friend. They give you leverage. High output divided by fixed costs means low per unit costs, which means competitive pricing, which means more orders, which means more output. The flywheel spins. But when growth slows, when demand plateaus or shifts, those same fixed costs become a vice. You can't shut down a blast furnace for a quarter. You can't lay off a town. You can't renegotiate a pension that was promised 40 years ago to a man who gave his lungs to your coke ovens. Bethlehem Steel in the 1920s and 1930s was building the most impressive industrial system in American history. It was also building the most expensive one, and the difference between impressive and expensive is only visible in hindsight, or in a downturn. But downturns were decades away. What was coming next was something far more dramatic: war. Before we get to the war, we need to talk about a place, because this story has a second character, not a person but a location. A spit of land jutting into the Chesapeake Bay, just southeast of Baltimore, Maryland. Sparrows Point. Bethlehem Steel acquired the Sparrows Point Steelworks in 1916, and it was, from the beginning, a strategic masterstroke. The location was almost absurdly perfect. Deep water access meant raw materials, iron ore from South America, coal from Appalachia, could arrive by ship, bypassing the railroads and their freight costs. The same deep water meant finished products. Steel plate, structural beams, and eventually entire ships could leave the same way. The Chesapeake Bay opened directly to the Atlantic. You couldn't design a better location for an industrial operation if you tried. At its peak, Sparrows Point would become the largest steelmaking facility in the world, not in America, in the world. Over 3,000 acres of blast furnaces, open hearth furnaces, rolling mills, coke ovens, and shipyards, an entire industrial city unto itself, with its own power plant, its own railroad system, its own company town where workers lived in houses owned by Bethlehem Steel, bought groceries at stores supplied by Bethlehem Steel, and sent their children to schools funded by Bethlehem Steel taxes. If you had stood at the centre of Sparrows Point in 1943 and looked in any direction, you would have seen nothing but Bethlehem. The sky was orange from the furnaces. The air tasted like sulphur and hot metal. The ground vibrated with the rhythm of rolling mills, and the water, the dark water of the Chesapeake, was lined with hulls in various stages of completion, each one a warship being born. Sparrows Point was the crown jewel. It was also, in the language of systems thinking, the single biggest node in the network, the point of maximum output, maximum employment, maximum capability, and maximum vulnerability. Because when a system depends this heavily on one location, that location doesn't just produce steel, it produces risk. But in 1916, and for decades after, the risk was invisible. What was visible was power. Raw, industrial, undeniable power. December the 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. America is at war, and America has a problem. The United States Navy has just lost or suffered damage to a significant portion of its Pacific Fleet. The country needs ships, destroyers, cruisers, cargo vessels, landing craft, tankers, and it needs them at a speed that has never been attempted in the history of naval construction. This is Bethlehem Steel's moment. The moment everything the company has built, the furnaces, the mills, the shipyards, the workforce, the decades of military production experience, converges into a single overwhelming purpose. The man at the top of Bethlehem Steel during the war was Eugene Grace, who had been running the company since Schwab's influence waned in the late 1930s. Grace was not Schwab. He lacked Schwab's charisma, his public flair. But Grace was a production man, an operator, and in wartime, operators win. What mattered was output, tonnage, hulls in the water. And Grace made a promise. The exact wording varies across historical accounts, but the substance was consistent and staggering. Bethlehem Steel would deliver roughly a ship a day to the United States military. A ship a day. Let that sink in. A modern warship is not a simple object. It's thousands of tons of steel, shaped and welded and fitted with engines, plumbing, wiring, weapon systems, navigation equipment. Building one is a feat of engineering. Building one per day is a feat of industrial choreography that borders on the miraculous, and Bethlehem did it. Across its shipyards, Sparrows Point, Fall River in Quincy, Massachusetts, Staten Island, San Francisco, and others, Bethlehem Steel operated one of the largest shipbuilding operations ever assembled. The yards ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 3 shifts, rotating endlessly. Cranes swinging steel plate through the night. Welders working by arc light, sparks cascading like orange rain into the dark water below. The sound was constant, a percussive wall of hammering, grinding, riveting, and the deep groan of metal being bent into shape. The numbers from this period are almost incomprehensible. During the course of World War II, Bethlehem Shipbuilding produced approximately 1,121 vessels for the Allied war effort. That's not a typo. Over 1,100 ships, destroyers, aircraft carriers, cargo vessels, landing ships. Bethlehem's yards accounted for a significant share of total American naval construction during the war. This was Bethlehem Steel's finest hour. The company that had learned war in 1886 had spent 60 years preparing for this moment, and it delivered beyond what anyone, including the military, thought possible. The furnaces ran at maximum capacity. The shipyards performed at speeds that rewrote the textbooks on industrial production. The workers, many of them women for the first time, filling roles vacated by men sent overseas, performed with a combination of patriotic fervour and sheer physical endurance that defies comfortable modern analogies. Bethlehem Steel didn't just contribute to winning the war, it was one of the engines that made victory mechanically possible. And here is the thing about finest hours. They are, by definition, peaks. What comes after a peak is not another peak. What comes after a peak is the long, uncertain question of what you do when the thing that made you extraordinary is no longer needed. But before we leave the war, we need to stop and look at the people inside the machine. Because the numbers, 1,100 ships, 300,000 employees, a ship a day, are abstractions. And abstractions don't sweat. They don't lose hearing. They don't come home at dawn with burns on their forearms and metal dust in their lungs. The wartime production miracle at Bethlehem Steel was built on human bodies. 12-hour shifts were standard. In the shipyards, men and women worked in conditions that would shut down a modern facility in minutes. Confined spaces filled with welding fumes, steel decks that radiated heat in summer and cold in winter. Noise levels that made verbal communication impossible. You learned to read lips. You learned to communicate with hand signals. You learned to feel the vibration of a crane moving overhead before you heard it, because by the time you heard it, you might already be underneath it. The injury rates were staggering. Burns, lacerations, crushed limbs, falls from scaffolding, flash blindness from arc welding without adequate eye protection. The medical facilities at the larger yards were essentially small hospitals, not because Bethlehem was generous, but because the volume of injuries demanded it. A man with a burned hand couldn't weld. A man with a broken arm couldn't rivet. The medical staff existed to get workers back on the line, not to ensure their long-term health. And then there was the invisible damage. The coke ovens at Sparrows Point and Bethlehem produced the processed coal needed for steel making, and the men who worked those ovens breathed chemicals that would take years or decades to manifest as disease. Lung cancer, mesothelioma, chronic respiratory failure. These were not immediate casualties. They were delayed casualties, men who survived the war only to be killed slowly by the work that helped win it. The emotional landscape was equally complex. During the war, the work carried meaning. You weren't just making steel. You weren't just welding a hull. You were building a ship that would carry American soldiers across the Atlantic. You were forging armor that would protect someone's son. The exhaustion was real, but so was the purpose, and purpose is a powerful analgesic. After the war, the purpose evaporated. The shipyards scaled down. The emergency contracts ended, and tens of thousands of workers, particularly women who had entered the industrial workforce for the first time, were displaced. The jobs didn't disappear overnight, but the urgency did. And with the urgency went the meaning, the overtime pay, and for many, the employment itself. The pride remained. Ask any steelworker from that generation, and they would tell you what they built. They would name the ships. They would describe the bridges. They would tell you about the night the Golden Gate steel shipped, or the morning a destroyer slid down the ways at Fall River. The pride was bone deep and permanent. But pride doesn't pay pensions, and the bodies that built those ships were aging, wearing down, developing the ailments that decades of industrial labour inscribe on human tissue. Every one of those workers was a future obligation, a pension check, a health insurance claim, a promise made when the furnaces were hot and the money was flowing. The human cost of Bethlehem Steel's greatness was paid in instalments, and the instalments would keep coming for decades after the last furnace went cold. The war ended, the furnaces did not. America in the late 1940s and 1950s was a nation in the grip of an extraordinary expansion. Soldiers came home, families formed, suburbs sprawled outward from every major city. And all of it, the houses, the highways, the bridges, the schools, the hospitals, the office towers, the shopping centres, needed steel. Bethlehem Steel rode this wave with the confidence of a company that had just helped win a world war. Production remained high. Employment remained robust. The towns that depended on Bethlehem, the Bethlehems, the Johnstowns, the Sparrows Points, hummed with post-war prosperity, new cars in the driveways, new appliances in the kitchens, union wages that could support a family, buy a home, send a kid to college. This was the American industrial dream in its purest form. A man could walk into a steel plant with a high school diploma, work hard, and build a middle-class life. The company would employ him, the union would protect him, the pension would sustain him. The system worked. And because the system worked, nobody questioned it. Nobody asked whether the cost structure was sustainable at lower volumes. Nobody asked what would happen if foreign competitors entered the market. Nobody asked whether a company built for wartime production could remain competitive in a peacetime economy that was slowly, imperceptibly changing the rules. This is the moment, the late 1950s, the early 1960s, when Bethlehem Steel looks most invincible. Record output, record employment, a product that America cannot function without, a workforce that believes, with good reason, that the steel industry is permanent. This is as good as it gets, and decline doesn't announce itself. The first signs were easy to miss. They didn't arrive as a crisis. They arrived as numbers on a spreadsheet. Import figures, price comparisons, market share percentages that shifted by fractions of a point. The kind of data that a confident company files under not a problem, Japanese steel. In the decades after World War II, Japan had rebuilt its steel industry from rubble, literally. The country's old mills had been bombed into scrap, which meant that when Japan rebuilt, it rebuilt with the newest technology available. Basic oxygen furnaces replaced the open hearth furnaces that American mills still relied on. Continuous casting replaced the older ingot and rolling process. Japanese mills were designed from scratch for efficiency, and they achieved it. Lower energy cost per ton, faster throughput, fewer workers per unit of output. And then there was German steel, and Korean steel, and Brazilian steel. Each country rebuilding or building new, each one installing technology that American mills, Bethlehem included, had been too busy, too profitable, or too invested in existing equipment to adopt. The imports didn't flood the market all at once. They seeped in. A contract here, a bid lost there. A customer who used to buy Bethlehem structural beams now buying Japanese beams at a price Bethlehem couldn't match without losing money on the order. Each individual loss was small. The pattern was enormous. But the foreign competition was only half the squeeze. The other half came from inside America itself. Mini-mills. A mini-mill is a steel production facility that uses electric arc furnaces to melt scrap steel. Old cars, demolished buildings, industrial waste, and reshape it into new products. Mini-mills are smaller than integrated mills. They employ fewer workers. They require less capital. They don't need iron ore mines or coke ovens or blast furnaces. They don't need company towns. They don't carry decades of pension obligations. And they were getting better. Fast. In the 1960s and early 1970s, Mini-mills were considered a lower-tier competitor, good enough for rebar and simple construction products, but not capable of producing the high-quality structural steel and plate that companies like Bethlehem specialized in. The integrated producers looked at mini-mills the way a luxury automaker might look at a go-kart manufacturer. Interesting, not a threat. This was a catastrophic misread. Companies like Nucor, founded in 1966, headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina, were systematically improving mini-mill technology. Year by year, the quality of electric arc furnace steel improved. Year by year, the range of products mini-mills could produce expanded, and year by year, the cost advantage of mini-mills over integrated producers widened. Because a mini-mill didn't carry the weight that Bethlehem carried. It didn't have blast furnaces built in the 1920s that needed constant relining. It didn't have pension obligations stretching back to the Roosevelt administration. It didn't have railroad networks and ore ships and coke ovens consuming capital just to stay operational. Nucor's cost per ton was lower. Its decision-making was faster. Its workforce was non-union, paid on performance incentives that aligned individual effort with company output. It was lean, adaptive, and hungry. Everything Bethlehem Steel was not. And here's the parallel narrative that makes this tragic. Bethlehem's leadership wasn't ignorant. They could see the imports, they could see the mini-mills. Internal reports documented the cost gap, the technology gap, the competitive pressures. But seeing a problem and being able to respond to it are two very different things. What do you do when your blast furnaces are 40 years old and a replacement costs billions? What do you do when your pension obligations are legally binding and growing every year? What do you do when your workforce is unionized and any attempt to reduce headcount triggers a strike that costs more than the savings? What do you do when your entire business model, vertical integration, massive scale, long-term contracts, was designed for a world that no longer exists? You make reasonable decisions, you cut where you can, you negotiate where you can, you invest where you can afford to, and none of it is enough. Because the gap between what you need to spend to modernize and what you can afford to spend is growing every quarter. The math is turning against you, and there is no version of the math that turns back. The squeeze doesn't kill you in a year, it kills you in a generation, slowly, predictably, while you watch. 1982. This is the year the furnace cracks. Not literally, though the furnaces were aging badly enough that the metaphor is barely a metaphor. What cracked in 1982 was the illusion that Bethlehem Steel was still a healthy company navigating temporary headwinds, the illusion that the imports would recede, the mini-mills would plateau, the construction market would rebound, and the old order would reassert itself. In 1982, Bethlehem Steel reported a loss of approximately $1.5 billion. $1.5 billion in 1982 dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $4.5 billion in today's money. For a single year. For a company that a generation earlier had been one of the most profitable industrial enterprises on Earth. The loss was not caused by one thing. It was caused by everything, simultaneously. The American economy was in recession, which crushed construction demand. Import competition was at record levels, which crushed pricing. Energy costs had spiked following the oil shocks of the 1970s, which crushed margins. And the fixed cost structure, the blast furnaces, the pensions, the company towns, the maintenance backlog, ground on relentlessly, consuming cash whether the mills were running at capacity or sitting half idle. This is the compounding causality chain in full force. Cost pressure plus demand erosion plus foreign competition plus aging infrastructure plus legacy obligations plus recession. Each force individually manageable. Together, unsurvivable. Bethlehem's response was the only response available. Contraction. Major operations were shut down. Thousands of workers were laid off. Entire production lines were mothballed. The company that had once defined itself by growth was now defining itself by what it could afford to cut. And in the towns that depended on Bethlehem, the layoffs landed like artillery. Imagine a community where 40% of the working adults are employed by one company. Now imagine that company announces it's eliminating 5,000 positions. The steelworkers lose their jobs. Then the restaurants that fed them lose their customers. Then the shops that clothed their families lose their revenue. Then the landlords who rented them houses lose their tenants. Then the tax base collapses, and the schools and roads and services that held the town together begin to fray. This is not economic theory. This is what happened. In Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in Johnstown, in Lackawanna, in Sparrows Point. Real towns, real families, real lives restructured by forces that no individual worker or manager or mayor could control. The workers who lived through 1982 describe it in remarkably consistent terms. Shock. Not anger, not yet. Shock. Because the steel mill was supposed to be permanent. Your father worked there. Your grandfather worked there. You were supposed to work there until retirement and then collect your pension and watch your son walk through the same gate. The mill was not a job. It was a covenant. And covenants are not supposed to break. But this one was breaking. And 1982 was not the end of the breaking. It was the beginning. After 1982, Bethlehem Steel entered a period that can only be described as managed disintegration. The company didn't collapse all at once. It shed pieces of itself, plants, product lines, subsidiaries, entire divisions, in a series of strategic retreats that were presented as rational restructuring but felt, to the people inside them, like amputations. 1992. The Johnstown plant's close. Johnstown, Pennsylvania, a town that had already been devastated by the catastrophic flood of 1889 and had rebuilt itself around steel. Bethlehem's presence in Johnstown stretched back decades. Thousands of families depended on those mills, and now the mills were dark. The parking lots that had once been full at shift change, 3,000 cars arriving and departing in waves every 8 hours, were empty. Weeds pushed through the asphalt. Chain-link fences went up around buildings that had been the economic heart of the community for generations. 1995, steelmaking ends at the Bethlehem plant itself. This is the one that resonates most deeply, because this is the origin. This is where it started. The Lehigh River, the blast furnaces, the rolling mills, the company that gave its name to the town or the town that gave its name to the company, depending on how you tell the story. 140 years of continuous steel production. Over. The furnaces that had burned since the 19th century went cold for the last time. Walk through the Bethlehem plant in 1996. The silence is the first thing you notice. These buildings were designed for noise. The roar of blast furnaces, the thunder of rolling mills, the clang of steel being moved by overhead cranes. Without that noise, the spaces feel wrong, cavernous, haunted. Your footsteps echo off walls that are still stained with decades of soot and iron dust. The air smells like rust and old grease. Pigeons nest in the rafters where sparks used to fly. 1997. Bethlehem exits shipbuilding entirely. The shipyards that built over 1,100 warships during World War II sold. The capability that had been Bethlehem's most dramatic contribution to American history, abandoned. This was supposed to be a survival move, a shedding of unprofitable assets to focus resources on core steelmaking. But the core was already hollowed out. Each closure followed the same pattern. Announcement, shock, negotiation, failure to negotiate, closure, silence, and then the slow, grinding aftermath. Unemployment, outmigration, declining property values, shuttered businesses, towns trying to reinvent themselves without the only industry they'd ever known. The dominoes didn't fall fast. They fell with a terrible, grinding deliberation. By the late 1990s, Bethlehem Steel was a ghost of its former self. The workforce that had once numbered over 300,000 had been reduced to fewer than 13,000. The sprawling empire of mines, mills, shipyards, and company towns had been carved down to a handful of steelmaking operations running at reduced capacity. The stock price, which had once made Bethlehem a blue-chip cornerstone of institutional portfolios, had collapsed to single digits. And still the obligations remained. This is the cruelest arithmetic in the story. You can close a plant, you can sell a shipyard, you can lay off workers and mothball furnaces and cancel contracts, but you cannot close a pension, you cannot lay off a retiree. Every worker who had ever been promised a pension by Bethlehem Steel, and there were over 95,000 of them, was still owed that pension, whether the company was making steel or not. Every retiree who had been promised health benefits was still entitled to those benefits, whether the furnaces were running or cold. The pension and retiree health obligations alone were estimated at billions of dollars, billions, for a company that could barely generate enough revenue to keep its remaining operations running. The obligations didn't shrink when the company shrank. They just consumed a larger and larger percentage of whatever money was left. This is what a systems failure looks like in its final stage. Not a dramatic explosion, not a villain twirling his mustache, just math. Implacable, compounding, unanswerable math. Revenue declining, costs fixed or rising, the gap widening every quarter, and no combination of cuts, sales, or restructurings capable of closing it. On October 15th, 2001, barely a month after the September 11th attacks had plunged the American economy into uncertainty, Bethlehem Steel filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing was not a surprise. Analysts had been predicting it for years. The company's financial statements told the story plainly for anyone willing to read them. But there is a difference between expecting something and experiencing it. For the workers still employed at Bethlehem's remaining plants, the bankruptcy filing was a death sentence with a delayed execution date. Chapter 11 meant the company would try to reorganize. Everyone knew it wouldn't work. It didn't work. In 2003, Bethlehem Steel's assets were sold to the International Steel Group, a company founded by investor Wilbur Ross, specifically to acquire distressed steel assets at bargain prices. ISG paid approximately $325 million for the remains of Bethlehem Steel. $325 million for a company that had once been valued in the billions, that had built the infrastructure of a nation, that had produced more warships than most countries' entire navies, and the pensions. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the federal agency that insures private sector pensions, assumed Bethlehem's pension obligations. It was one of the largest pension defaults in American history. Retirees who had been promised specific benefit levels received reduced payments. The promises made decades ago, in the heat of the furnaces and the flush of wartime production, were honoured, but only partially. The federal government picked up the tab, which means the American taxpayer picked up the tab, which means that in a very real sense, the cost of Bethlehem Steel's collapse was socialised across the entire nation. Not a scandal, not incompetence, not a single catastrophic mistake. A system, vast, integrated, purpose-built for a world that had moved on, grinding to a halt because its own weight exceeded its capacity to generate forward motion. The negation stack is important here, because the human instinct when confronted with a collapse of this magnitude is to look for a villain, someone to blame, someone who made the wrong call, who was greedy or short-sighted or corrupt. And while Bethlehem Steel's leadership made plenty of debatable decisions over the decades, compensation packages that looked tone-deaf, investment choices that prioritized dividends over modernization, a slowness to adopt new technology. None of these decisions, individually or even collectively, were the cause. The cause was structural. The cause was a business model designed for an era of unchallenged American industrial dominance, operating in an era where that dominance was being eroded from every direction, by foreign competitors with newer equipment, by domestic mini-mills with lower costs, by a construction market that was increasingly price-sensitive, by financial markets that demanded quarterly returns from a business that operated on multi-decade capital cycles. Bethlehem Steel didn't fail because it was badly run. It failed because the world changed and the system couldn't. So what happens to an empire after it dies? Usually it gets erased, the buildings come down, the land gets redeveloped. A shopping centre goes up where the furnaces used to be. A parking lot covers the ground where molten iron once flowed. The physical evidence of what was there disappears, and within a generation nobody remembers what the place used to sound like, smell like, feel like. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, made a different choice. When the Bethlehem plant closed, there was enormous pressure to demolish the blast furnaces. They were rusting. They were expensive to maintain even in dormancy. They occupied prime real estate in a town desperately searching for a post-industrial identity. Every conventional economic argument pointed toward demolition. Tear them down, clean the land, start over. But the furnaces stayed. They stayed because enough people in Bethlehem, residents, civic leaders, preservationists, former workers, understood that these structures were not just industrial equipment. They were memory. They were testimony. They were the physical proof that something extraordinary had happened here, that this small river town had once been the beating heart of American industrial power, that the steel in the Golden Gate Bridge and the Empire State Building and 1,100 warships had been born in these furnaces, poured from these ladles shaped by these hands, And so the blast furnaces became the centerpiece of something new. Steel stacks, an arts and cultural campus built in the shadow of the old furnaces, concert venues, festival grounds, public gathering spaces, the rusted steel rising above it all, lit at night with coloured lights that shift and pulse like a slow, mechanical heartbeat. The juxtaposition is almost surreal. Where molten iron once ran at 2,700 degrees, a folk musician plays guitar on a summer evening. Where the noise once made men deaf, children eat ice cream and listen to a jazz quartet. Where the air once tasted like sulphur and coke dust, couples walk hand in hand beneath structures that look, in the right light, like the ribcage of something vast and ancient. Steel cathedrals, that's what people call them. And the term is not wrong. There is something sacred about these structures, not in a religious sense, but in the sense that they command a specific kind of attention. You stand beneath them and you feel scale, you feel time, you feel the accumulated weight of 140 years of human effort, compressed into rust and rivets and silence. Steel stacks is not a museum, it's not a memorial, it's something harder to categorize, a place where the past is not explained or curated but simply present. The furnaces don't tell you what to think about Bethlehem Steel. They just stand there, enormous and undeniable, and let you think whatever you need to think. Where molten iron used to be, there's light and sound, same structure, different era. Here's the lesson, and it's not a comfortable one. Steel doesn't disappear, it relocates. The demand for steel didn't end when Bethlehem Steel collapsed. The world uses more steel today than it did at Bethlehem's peak, vastly more. But the steel is made in different places, by different companies, using different methods. It's made in mini-mills in the American South, it's made in enormous integrated plants in China, India, South Korea, Brazil. The product survived. The system that used to produce it did not. And this is the pattern that Bethlehem Steel's story illuminates, not just for steel, but for any industry, any institution, any system built on the assumption that current conditions are permanent. The world doesn't owe you continuity. Markets don't owe you loyalty. Governments don't owe you protection forever. The fact that you were essential yesterday does not guarantee that you will be essential tomorrow. And the bigger you are, the more people you employ, the more towns you anchor, the more obligations you carry. The harder it is to adapt when the rules change. Your own weight becomes the thing that holds you in place while the world moves around you. Bethlehem Steel's leaders were not fools. They were intelligent, experienced industrialists operating within a system that had been optimized for a world that no longer existed. They made reasonable decisions, every single one defensible in context, that collectively amounted to a slow walk off a cliff. Not because any individual step was wrong, but because the direction was wrong, and the system was too large, too rigid, too burdened with legacy to change direction. This is what systems failure looks like, not a single crack. 1,000 microfractures, each one invisible, each one insignificant, accumulating over decades until the whole structure is compromised, and the only question is which winter finally brings it down. Present but not competitive, available but not chosen, recognized but not viable. That is how empires end, not with a betrayal, not with a scandal, but with a slow, structural divergence between what the world needs and what the system can provide. Pullback, wide shot. A summer evening at Steel Stacks. 1,000 people gathered beneath the furnaces listening to music, laughing, living in the afterlife of an industrial giant. The coloured lights play across the rusted steel. The sky above Bethlehem is clear, clearer than it's been in 140 years. No haze, no smoke, no orange glow from the blast furnaces. The bones remain. Steel doesn't disappear. It just stops moving. But the bones remain, standing in a river valley in Pennsylvania, waiting for someone to walk beneath them and wonder what it sounded like when the world was being built. Fade on the silent furnaces, monument and warning.